Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to take these incredibly complex, chaotic streams of information and really distill them down to what matters.
And today, we're wading into something that feels less like a landscape and more like like a churning invisible sea.
The modern information environment, and it is a chaotic sea. I think so many of us feel like we're struggling to navigate it.
We are. And it's because almost everyone, and I mean from the individual person scrolling their phone all the way up to legislators, is reacting to symptoms. We're not getting the full systemic picture.
It's like you're running around trying to clean up chemical spills in a river.
Exactly, but you haven't even mapped the river yet. You don't know where the pollution is actually coming from.
And that analogy, it really hits hard because the stakes just feel enormous. I mean, our sources point out that in this environment where our attention is literally the product being sold.
It's the commodity.
It's the commodity, yeah. It structurally forces these huge, complex issues into really stark black and white terms, and it just pollutes our mental space.
And that low-quality content, it spreads fear, it spreads hate, and it's constantly provoking us, pushing us to take a side. It's just exhausting.
It's this vicious feedback loop, and we feel like we have to do something to fix it, right?
And that's the trap. That is the core of the problem, that compulsion to act. Because when we feel it, what do? We almost always rush to blame the latest technology.
Right. Today it's AI, yesterday it was social media, before that cable news.
And then we immediately call for some kind of legislative intervention. We find a probable cause, usually a very simple reductionist one, and then we just rush straight to a solution.
But intervening when you're blind to the system, that's the definition of putting the cart before the horse, isn't it?
It is. Trying to control information flow without understanding the system you're in is so incredibly risky. Think about it like introducing an invasive species into a physical environment.
Or using pesticides without knowing the full impact on the food chain.
Exactly. You risk these catastrophic, cascading, unintended consequences that can be so much worse than the original problem you were trying to solve.
So the approach has to be, what, slower?
It has to be both modest and ambitious.
Yeah.
Modest in that we need to be extremely cautious about intervening right now because we could just make a bigger mess.
And ambitious.
Ambitious in the sense that we have to build a whole new field, a truly interdisciplinary one, dedicated to studying this system. We need to build essentially an information ecology.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're stepping back. We're not going to focus on the latest symptom, the disinformation panic of the week.
No more moral panics. We want to see the forest for the trees.
So we'll establish what this information environment actually is. We'll trace a path using the development of physical ecology, which is a fascinating story in itself, and then we'll apply those lessons to history.
Yeah, looking at case studies from different media epochs, orality, print, electric, and digital. We're looking for patterns, universal patterns of information competition that, they're consistent whether you're dealing with cuneiform tablets or viral videos.
Okay, so where do we start on this roadmap?
Well, we start with the metaphors we're already using, things like information pollution or needing a resilient information environment. They've become pretty mainstream.
But you're saying we need to move past just using them as metaphors and start a genuine systemic study.
We do. And for that, the blueprint is right there for us. It's in the evolution of fields like earth sciences and ecology.
Right, because back in the 19th and 20th centuries, science was often very reductionist, wasn't it? It was all about studying a single part in isolation.
Completely. But they pretty quickly realized that to understand something as complex as climate or biodiversity, you needed a holistic approach. You needed systems thinking.
And that wasn't an easy shift, I'm guessing.
Not at all. I mean, think about trying to understand the Earth. It meant you had to integrate all these separate disciplines. Seismology, oceanography, meteorology. They all spoke completely different scientific languages.
So what forced them to start talking to each other?
External pressure, mostly. You had resource prospectors, philanthropists, and then the big one was the massive funding from the military after World War II.
They needed to understand the whole system for military purposes.
Yeah, and then by the 60s, with growing fears over nuclear war and the impact of pesticides, that movement toward a single, vast, complex system really solidified.
And ecology went through the same thing. I'm thinking of someone like Alexander von Humboldt back in the 19th century. He's watching deforestation in Venezuela.
And he's not just seeing fewer trees, right? He's seeing the water level drop in the lake. He's seeing the land become barren. He realized that taking out the trees meant the entire forest ecosystem couldn't regulate temperature or retain moisture anymore.
He saw it as a connected systemic problem, one of the first European scientists to really frame human impact that way.
And that realization that all the components are interdependent is just critical. The term ecology came later, in 1866, but it didn't become a really robust predictive science until the mid-20th century.
What changed?
The concept of the ecosystem. It finally gave them a reliable framework for studying things like energy flows, food chains, all those interdependent relationships. And that's what allowed ecology to go from just being descriptive to being predictive.
And that is the exact leap we need to make for information ecology.
It is. And a couple of classic case studies really show why we need to make that shift away from reductionism.
Let's start with acid rain.
Okay, so acid rain was first identified way back in 1852. A guy named Robert Angus Smith, he was worried about industrial pollution from burning fossil fuels. Sulfur, nitrogen, all of that.
But the key to solving it wasn't some sudden, brilliant fix. It took decades of really systematized, standardized research.
And this is where the idea of baselines becomes so vital. You had scientists with these long-running studies like one at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Farm, where they've been monitoring rainfall since 1872.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is. And in 1963, they tested a sample and found it was about 100 times more acidic than they expected. Without that long-term baseline data, that systemic change would have just been dismissed. People would have said it was a fluke, an anomaly.
So the baseline proved there was a real long-term problem, and then the ecologists actually proved the solution, right?
They did. In Ontario, they used something called the Experimental Lakes Area. These were healthy, monitored lakes, and they conducted controlled experiments where they gradually increased the acidity.
And what happened?
Well, just what you'd expect. The nutrients in fish started dying off. But, and this is the critical part, when they stopped raising the pH, the ecosystem started to rebound.
So the insight is just incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
You can't solve a problem like acid rain without that long-term monitoring, without establishing baselines, and without doing system analysis. You can't just fix one chimney.
You have to understand the entire atmospheric and chemical system. And that brings us to the second case, DDT and apex predators. And this one might be even more instructive for information ecology.
Why is that?
Because it shows the fundamental danger of reductionist thinking when you're dealing with a complex system.
Okay, so set the scene. It's the early 1960s.
Naturalists start noticing that the eggs of birds of prey, like peregrine falcons, are thinning. They're becoming incredibly fragile, and the birds are literally crushing their own eggs in the nest.
And this is coinciding with widespread pesticide use. So the obvious first step, the reductionist step, is what?
Take the falcons into the lab and feed them the pesticide DDT directly. See what happens. The lab experiments failed. Direct exposure didn't cause the egg thinning. Now, if they had stopped there with that reductionist view, the conclusion would have been that DDT was harmless.
But they didn't stop. They started thinking like ecologists, thinking about the whole system.
Exactly. They realized the problem wasn't direct exposure. It was the entire food chain.
How did that work?
It turns out DDT metabolizes in the body into a compound called DDE. DDE gets into the whole food chain, earthworms, robins, fish, and because it's fat-soluble and it persists for a long time, it bioaccumulates.
So it builds up over time.
And it concentrates in lethal doses in the apex predators at the top of the food chain, like falcons. The lab tests failed because they totally missed that crucial ecosystem process of accumulation and magnification.
So how did they finally prove it was the DDE?
Through a convergence of methods, what scientists call consilience. They had to bring together historical egg collections, some dating back decades, toxicology reports, and a deep, deep understanding of food chains and even meteorology to see how it spread. It took sustained, systematized research that spanned years and multiple scientific fields.
So, if DDE was the invisible threat accumulating in the physical food chain, what's the invisible threat accumulating in our information food chain?
That's the question. And to answer it, we need the same capabilities for information ecology. We need consistent, standardized measurements. We need a shared language across disciplines, studying the people, the technology, and the outputs together.
And you need those baselines to know what a healthy information environment even looks like. And long-term research that looks at changes over decades, even centuries.
Without that kind of systematization, Our research is just going to stay fragmented. It'll be easily dismissed. It will fail to provide the kind of defensible, transparent evidence we need to get consensus on politically charged topics like AI governance or platform regulation.
We risk staying experts in one type of content, like being an expert on the apple.
While being completely ignorant of gravity, the force that defines its meaning and its behavior.
That sets a heavy requirement for the science. So before we even begin to measure, we have to define the building blocks, right? Let's start with the biggest possible canvas.
Okay, so we define the information environment, or the IE, as the broad space where all information exists. It includes all its forms and all the surrounding conditions. Think of it like the entire climate or geography of a place.
So it includes things like the economy, the education system, the political climate, everything that shapes how information flows.
Exactly. And then within that environment, you have specific information ecosystems.
Yeah.
These are more limited communities, like a specific forest or river basin within the larger geography.
And these are defined by the interrelationships between three key components.
Right. The agents, that's us, the humans, the means, our tools, and the outputs, what we create and share. Those relationships are what create the climate for information competitions.
But before we get to those, we have to talk about information itself. You argue it's poorly understood, that we often confuse it with just content.
We do. Information is fundamentally potential. It is the ability to inform. It's not the thing itself. It manifests in all sorts of ways. Automatic biological responses, mimicry, learning new ideas that then lead to shareable content.
Okay, let's nail that distinction down, the difference between information and content. Give me the analogy that makes it stick.
Content is the apple that falls from the tree. It's the tangible output, the TikTok video, the printed pamphlet.
Yeah.
Information is gravity. It's the inherent fundamental force that dictates how that apple, the content, behaves, how it interacts with the environment, and how it informs whoever witnesses it. It's the ability to inform, not the thing itself.
So if a toddler sees a viral video and then tries to copy the dance, the video is the output, the content.
But the ability of that video to spark that learned behavior in the toddler, that's the information at work.
Right. And this leads to the whole complicated question of truth. Because if information is just potential, then truth isn't an inherent part of it.
Not at all. A loud sound informs a rabbit of danger. It doesn't matter if there's a true danger or not. The informing has already happened.
Truth, then, is slower. It's often subjective, it's harder to get to. It depends on social norms or on reaching a consensus, as the philosopher Jürgen Habermas would say.
The perfect example of this is the pineapple on pizza debate. It's a silly one, but it works.
Oh, okay.
The information that pineapple is delicious on pizza informs some people how great that dish could be. For others, that same piece of information informs them how important their idea of pizza purity is. Both are acts of informing, but they lead to these polarized subjective truths based entirely on social norms.
And our own biases and prejudices can stop us from accepting a truth, even when it arrives quickly. Like with the COVID-19 vaccine timeline.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
The scientific truth was that the rapid process was safe. But people who had been informed over years that drug testing normally takes 5 to 10 years drew the faulty conclusion that a rapid process couldn't possibly be trusted.
So that faulty conclusion, which was informed by their prior knowledge and maybe a lack of trust in institutions, still guided their choices.
And this is why attempts by democracies to govern content based only on truth are so fundamentally complicated. They're trying to regulate this dynamic subjective system with a fixed, often contentious endpoint.
So if you're writing social media standards, you have to recognize that one person's established truth based on their whole cultural frame might not be someone else's.
Exactly. So to study the IE, we have to look at the three pillars together. We can't isolate them.
Okay, let's make them concrete. Let's stick with that viral TikTok video example.
Okay. First, you have the agents, or what we call information animals. That's the human element. The teenager creating the video is the fundamental catalyst.
And what they share is filtered through their own cognition, their background, their education. It creates an information food chain.
Right. If they're sharing something because they want to feel seen or get clout, that intent shapes the output. And that, in turn, filters how the next agent reacts to it.
Okay, so that's the agent. Next are the means, the tools.
The smartphone, the editing software, the TikTok algorithm itself. The means determine the speed, the scale, and the cost of sharing that information.
And this is where the hype cycle kicks in. We get obsessed with the means. We say the algorithm is the problem.
Right. Innovation in means is shiny. It captures our imagination, and we tend to overemphasize it. but we neglect the system around it. The algorithm only matters because of the agents using it and the outputs they're generating.
And finally, the outputs, the shareable product, the viral dance, the political joke.
The output is the tangible evidence, but its meaning is totally contingent on context. That TikTok video gets a whole new meaning based on the comments, the shares, how the political news cycle frames it.
So if we only focus on the output, say, trying to get the video taken down, we might be missing the bigger picture.
Completely. You might miss that the agents are creating this content because they're disenfranchised. That's their circumstance. And they're using the means, the algorithm, to bypass traditional media. You have to analyze all three together. If you don't address the underlying circumstances of the agent, the ecosystem will just produce a new, maybe more resilient output of that same information.
Okay, so the most remarkable insight from comparing these ecosystems across history is that there seems to be this consistent universal pattern, a pattern that shows up right before large-scale conflict.
Yeah, it happens when two communities are competing to impose their version of reality on each other. And this pattern really proves that just focusing on the newest technology or the most recent symptom is a huge mistake.
Because the underlying dynamics are the same, whether you're using stone carvings or social media.
Exactly. So let's define the 6 components of this pattern. Okay. Number 1, a technological or means shift. A new way to process or send information is introduced, and it leads to more output, faster distribution.
A capacity increase. At least one of the communities sees a recent jump in the number of people who can meaningfully engage with that information. Usually that means higher literacy or better access to the new tools.
An ideational challenge. A powerful new idea emerges. Democracy, abolition, anti-colonial nationalism. And it directly challenges a deeply held existing idea or power structure.
4 is propagation and reaction. All sorts of agents, profiteers, believers, political actors, they use the available means and outputs to spread the new idea. And that causes an equally vigorous, often fearful reaction from their opponents who use the exact same tools.
The byproducts. This competition leads to information floods, pollution, noise, and just extreme cognitive dissonance for everybody.
Yeah.
And finally, number 6, at least one side attempts a control attempt. The established power tries to control, criminalize, or suppress the flow of information. But the historical record shows this almost never works out well for the side doing the suppressing.
So this pattern suggests that technology is a catalyst, but the real risk of conflict explodes when those changes in capacity and ideology intersect with existing cultural fault lines.
That's it, exactly.
All right, so let's apply this. Our first historical deep dive takes us to the orality epoch. We're talking ancient Greece, specifically the competition between Athens and Sparta before the Peloponnesian War.
All right, so around 431 BCE. And it's important to remember writing existed, but it wasn't the means of mass communication. The primary political tool was speech.
So the catalytic innovation wasn't a single device, but a combination of things. Mass participation in politics in Athens, their radical democracy, plus advances in ships and roads that let people and information move faster.
Yeah, the core means of processing political information was the act of speaking and debating in the assembly. And what we see are two deeply, deeply divergent information ecosystems in competition.
On one side, you have Athens. It's a radical democracy. It's open, it's trade-focused, high output, built on the principle of isagoria, the equal right for citizens to speak.
And Sparta is the complete antithesis. It's a closed oligarchy, a rigid military culture, and they were famous for their laconic, simple speech. That speech style itself was an output that reinforced their ideology of discipline and brevity.
So the Athenian information flood was just undeniable. I mean, Pericles starts this massive building program. You've got the Parthenon, the reconstruction of the Acropolis, and doubling the long walls of the port of Piraeus.
And this wasn't just construction. It was a powerful outpour. It was a message promoting democracy, promoting their organizational capacity, broadcasting Athenian might to the world.
But that output sent these devastating unintended messages. It created a kind of pollution in the rival ecosystem of Sparta and their allies.
Right. To their allies in the Delian League, the funding for all this came from their tribute funds. So it signaled subjugation, not freedom. The physical output completely contradicted their democratic messaging.
And to Sparta, those huge defensive walls, which were finished after the Persian threat was gone, what message did that send? It sent a very clear one. Athens now sees Sparta as the fundamental threat, and that directly challenged Spartan hegemony, their traditional role as the military leader of the Hellenic world. And the concept of honor was this crucial thread running through both societies, this long-standing idea of hierarchy and position.
It was everything. Sparta saw itself as the defender of liberty, So when Corinth, one of their key allies, felt threatened by Athenian expansion, they successfully convinced Sparta to go to war by questioning their honor. They basically accused the Spartans of being slow and inactive while Athens was running circles around them. So that became the ideational challenge. Athens' new democratic economic reality was challenging Sparta's older, rigid, honor-based reality. And the Spartans were internally paralyzed by their own closed system. That system was vital because their entire society was built on keeping down the helots, a subjugated population that vastly outnumbered them.
So the fear of a helot uprising drove this constant paranoia.
Total paranoia. It necessitated strict control over information flow and a deep suspicion of all outsiders, especially the Athenians. And that paranoia, reinforced by their culture, even led to bad military decisions, like delaying battles to observe religious festivals.
So is it really that spark? Did they just not see the physical evidence of Athens getting stronger?
Oh, they saw it. But their internal ecosystem shaped how they interpreted it. Because their whole structure depended on control, their initial reaction was denial or delay. It was the information output that challenged their honor, their core identity, that finally forced them to act. The key takeaway is that Athenian actions had these cascading effects that were shaped entirely by the cultural paranoia and history of the rival Spartan ecosystem.
Okay, let's move forward a couple thousand years to 17th century England. We're in the print age now, watching the conflict build between King Charles I and the Puritan movement, the godly. This leads to the English Civil War.
And here, all 6 components of that pattern just line up perfectly.
The means shift. What did that look like?
You have the standardization of the English language, you have widespread paper usage and huge networks of letter writing, and of course the printing press. It had been around since 1476, but by the 17th century, it was really hitting its mass potential.
And this enabled a huge capacity increase. Literacy rates just soared, maybe up to 25% of the population, especially in towns.
And this wasn't a passive change. It was driven by the ideational challenge. The godly, the Puritans, had this powerful need to read the Bible for themselves, to interpret Scripture directly without going through the official church and state hierarchy.
So new schools popped up after the dissolution of the monasteries, creating this mass, politically aware readership, a population that could now engage with this new idea that the king was accountable to his subjects.
And that the official Anglican Church had too many popish Catholic elements. And then you have Charles I, whose own actions became this form of catastrophic communication.
How so?
Well, he created an echo chamber at court by appointing controversial favorites. He cut himself off from the traditional aristocracy, which severed the vital information flow that used to come from the counties to the center of government.
He also did something, what did you call it, a scarcity heuristic?
Yeah. He dissolved Parliament for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, just to avoid criticism. But what he inadvertently did was make that mechanism of critique exponentially more desired and more formidable when it finally came back.
And his deeds were sending all the wrong messages. His marriage to a visible Catholic, Henrietta Maria, the religious reforms by Archbishop Laud, it just fueled the popular fear that the end times were near and the Catholics were taking over.
His arbitrary taxes, banning newspapers because the Spanish ambassador complained. All of it just confirmed the public's paranoia that he was secretly aligning with their enemies.
So when the Long Parliament was finally called in 1640, the restrictions came off and the dam just burst.
The information flood was unbelievable. The number of printed books nearly quadrupled in 2 years. And this wasn't just political debate. It was a spike in anti-Catholic pamphlets, sensationalized atrocity stories about the Irish Rebellion, and the rise of what's called basically a precursor to paid news. It just polluted the whole system.
And Charles's control attempt, using the Star Chamber to criminalize dissent and ban publications,
was a complete failure. The influx of material, especially from Scotland, where the Covenanters were waging their own intense propaganda campaign, was just impossible to stop.
So the lesson here seems profound. A vibrant ecosystem fueled by these capacity increases and tech shifts, you just can't control it with heavy-handed repression.
Especially when the leader's own actions are communicating betrayal. The parliamentarians saw the new capacity, they successfully leveraged the printing press and popular anger, and they used pamphlets and petitions to completely delegitimize the king.
Okay, let's jump to the 20th century, bridging the print and electric ages. We're looking at Vietnam and the anti-colonial struggle. So the pattern of information competition is now being scaled up by radio and eventually television.
Right. And the means and capacity shifts were, ironically, seeded by the colonizers themselves. French colonial education unintentionally introduced liberal values. But more importantly, the widespread adoption of the simplified Romanized script, quote new, made literacy far more accessible.
So you get a rise in literacy, maybe 10–20%, and that enables a nationalist print boom.
Exactly. Radio also existed, though it was mostly controlled by the French. And the core competing realities pitted the French and later the U.S. back south, who were relying on colonial superiority and repression against the Vitmin in the north.
And their ideology was centered on fierce nationalism and anti-colonialism. They were brilliant at using historical threads like the legend of the Turing sisters to proselytize their cause.
A huge catalyst for the ideational challenge was a set of broken expectations. 90,000 Vietnamese served France in World War I, and they expected self-determination in return.
But their appeal to President Wilson at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference was completely ignored.
And that squashed those hopes and led figures like Ho Chi Minh to look for inspiration in radical anti-colonial writings instead. And the Vitmin show this uncanny, almost innate understanding of information ecology.
They made literacy a core resilience strategy. They set up mass education programs not just to teach reading, but to foster political awareness, making the population less susceptible to outside propaganda. And crucially, they mastered what's called behavior as communication, or propaganda of the deed. They introduced a strict code of behavior for their soldiers: respect, help, and protect the people, unquote. So by living among the villagers, building those bottom-up support networks, they communicated trust and legitimacy far more effectively than any speech or pamphlet ever could.
And that contrasted so sharply with the brutal physical repression and detachment of the French and the later Diem regime in the South. Diem's regime was just paranoid, banning gatherings of more than 7 people, alienating the Buddhist majority. His policies were interpreted as just more colonial repression.
His control attempt was through physical means and surveillance, but it just destroyed information flow and made his own people, his own agents, reject him.
And then, as the conflict heated up, you see the connecting of ecosystems, thanks to the electric age. Ho Chi Minh successfully used radio, and later TV, to bypass the U.S. leadership and appeal directly to the American public. That showed a really sophisticated understanding of the complexity of the U.S. information environment.
And then you have the self-immolations of the monks in 1963. They're covered by American journalists, and it turns the war into what was called gruesome entertainment for U.S. audiences.
It was an output of such visceral power that it just instantly undermined the U.S. government's narrative. The failure of the French and Diem was focusing on their message alone, while ignoring the fact that their brutal deeds were communicating their true intentions far louder than any rhetoric.
Okay, jumping to the digital age, post-1991 independent Ukraine. This is a crucial modern case study of complexity and severe fragmentation.
Yeah, Ukraine's information environment is less a single tapestry and more a patchwork. It was historically shaped by so many different foreign powers, Poles, Austro-Hungarians, Russians, and that resulted in these regional language gradients and varying identities.
And after independence, political leaders repeatedly inflamed those existing linguistic and regional threads for short-term political gain.
They sacrificed national cohesion for a momentary advantage. And this internal fragmentation was made so much worse by massive internal pollution. Oligarchs captured over 80% of the major media outlets, TV, radio, print, and used them for political influence and profit.
So the means of communication were just corrupted by the self-interest of the agents.
And that was formalized by the rise of Jinsa, that paid advertising disguised as news, which was really an extension of old Soviet media practices. This flood of low-quality, motivated content meant audiences were fundamentally unable to analyze their options. It just eroded trust, which was down at a shocking 30% by 2013.
And the political atmosphere was defined by this escalating competition. Both the EU and Russia were forcing Ukraine into a binary choice, which fueled intense information warfare and led to the Orange Revolution and then Euromaidan.
And Russia was actively interfering the whole time, sending political technologists and money to support their preferred candidates.
And in this environment, events acted as powerful catalysts. Economic decline, corruption, police brutality, and then finally Yanukovych pulling out of the EU deal. That's what turned social discontent into mass protests.
Critically, the repression used during Euromaidan, which was caught on camera and broadcast widely through digital means, that became the primary motivator for even more people to join. It shows that repression, intended to shut down information flow, can actually become the most effective piece of communication for the opposition.
And it's important to note that the limits of interference. Russia's constant attempts to negate Ukrainian identity, to brand Euromaidan a fascist coup, it paradoxically backfired.
It did. Continued Russian aggression has only hardened Ukrainian civil society and determination. It proved that just because a population speaks Russian doesn't mean they're loyal to a foreign power. The ecosystem, under extreme stress, actually developed resilience.
So the Ukrainian experience really confirms that historical pattern. External pressure, ideological competition, high domestic capacity, a highly educated population with high internet use, it leads to an information flood. And when those in power try to impose control while failing to meet the basic needs of their citizens, violence and resistance are often the result.
And that brings us to the future. Looking ahead, the hype to fear cycle is just continuing with new frontiers like AI and human-brain interfaces, or HBIs.
And the reports are already warning of cataclysmic risks, that malicious actors could exploit HBIs to alter thoughts, beliefs, or behaviors. It raises these immediate massive concerns about coercion and control.
And it's the exact same historical pattern, just in fast motion.
Yeah.
New innovation driven by profit, followed by immediate catastrophic warnings, and then immediate calls for governance. All before the system is even remotely understood.
It's that same rush to do something that we saw with the printing press and social media.
And a huge barrier right now is the data barrier. Independent researchers simply don't have access to the proprietary data held by the corporations developing this tech. Most of the findings we hear about come from the companies trying to sell the technology or from minimal government oversight.
So it's severely hindering the kind of long-term, systematized research we need for effective governance. We're back in that reductionist lab, just feeding the falcon the DDT instead of mapping the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the core question of resilience. What makes an information ecosystem truly strong? We often praise the Finnish model for media literacy, but we can't just copy and paste it without understanding the underlying societal conditions.
Right. The Finnish example suggests that resilience is deeper than just being able to spot disinformation.
It is. It includes things like high trust, critical thinking, a cultural concept of self-reliance they call sisu, and fundamentally, a society that consistently meets its citizens' basic physical needs. A safe environment, strong education. If citizens feel safe and supported, they are inherently less receptive to fear-based, low-quality information.
An information ecosystem reflects physical realities just as much as it shapes them. We can't effectively fight disinformation without addressing underlying issues like economic inequality and security.
If a society is struggling to provide basic safety and opportunity, it's just inherently less resilient to information threats. Right now, we are like those early Earth scientists were. We have bits and pieces. We have some seismology, some meteorology.
But we lack the unified theory, the shared language, the systematized long-term data needed to achieve that consilience and see the whole unified system.
And until information ecology develops and provides that holistic knowledge, we are basically condemned to repeat historical mistakes. We'll keep intervening blindly in a complex, dynamic system we just don't understand. The goal isn't just about the survival of democracy, it's about our ability to manage complexity itself.
So we've seen that these information environments have existed since humans first started communicating. They've evolved from the spoken word to cuneiforms, the printing press, and now to these hyper-complex digital networks where the pace of change is just accelerating drastically.
We have all this specialized knowledge, but we desperately lack the generalists and the systematized, decade-long data collection that we need to see the whole tapestry. Our ability to even identify what makes a system resilient depends on getting that broad ecological view.
So consider this. If we recognize that every major innovation in communication, from the alphabet all the way to AI, causes massive societal upheaval and forces these competing realities to clash.
And given that the pace of that change is accelerating exponentially,
How long can democracies afford to operate in a state of, well, technological enthusiasm but ecological blindness? What is the cost? Measured not just in social friction and internal pollution, but in real conflict and the loss of governmental legitimacy, of remaining experts in content while being utterly ignorant of the complex, dynamic system that shapes its meaning.
it's a question that really demands an answer before the system answers it for us.